Welcome to the third episode of Critically Realistic. In this podcast, we are searching to address controversial issues that affect our life and society. If you are sensible or getting offended easily, please stop the video and go back to your comfort zone. If not, please consider to like and subscribe. By doing so, you are helping us promote open conversation in a time of social crisis. In this episode, we will address the subject of the democratic crisis we are living in currently in the West. In the process of our investigation, we will address the following questions. What is causing the current democratic crisis? Why do we need democracy to start with? Is there a way to save the current system? And most importantly, why we must save democracy. Thank you for being part of a growing community that is searching to understand and want to fight for a better future. After many generations living within a democratic framework, people find it hard to truly define what democracy is, or at least the fundamental ideas that support it. We all know how to repeat that democracy is a governing system that promotes freedom and equality. We all hold the notion that it is a governing mechanism that allows people to elect people for the people and promotes fairness and accountability. Regardless, when asked, most people are not aware neither of how young is the concept of democracy, nor what were the fundamental philosophical ideas that brought it all to be. Democracy is revolutionary for many reasons. It flipped the concept of governance on its head. Before the creation of democracy, as we know it today, all governing systems were created to support the ruling class. Kings, aristocracy, tyranny, and autocracy are built in a way in which the concentration of power and unlimited control support the ruling class. In such a system, the majority of the population exists to support the ruling class. Their rights are limited to non-existence, laws are made and changed by the ruling class, and oppression is part of the system. Democracy is different. It is the first system that comes from the people for the people. As such, the interest of the people takes the main stage. A separation of forces exists between the ruling, judging, and enforcing powers, creating a balance of power to protect the system and its people. In a democracy, the government exists to serve the people. It is a revolutionary idea that cannot be taken for granted. After all, in the majority of the world, for the most significant part of human history, this was not the way we did business. This principle underlying the idea of democracy and defining it is a fundamental concept we should keep in mind throughout our investigation. This principle by itself should always be the first standard with which one should evaluate the state of a specific democratic system and its legitimacy. A long and complicated philosophical path has been taken in the West to achieve what many people see as obvious. To create the system and justify it, a long process of thinkers had to develop, debate, and establish ideas about the human condition that allowed the creation of such a revolutionary system. Human rights, duties, equality, freedom, and states were not evident at all. Nation-states did not exist before the 17th century in Europe. Passports did not exist before the Second World War. Income tax was uncommon before the middle of the 20th century, and a court system equal to or above the governing elite. Democracy as we know it today is young and can be seen as experimental. The US can be seen as the first one to establish it 200 years ago, while Europe, in its majority, established it much later. In some cases, toward the end of the 20th century, and in others, only after World War II. There is nothing obvious about our current society, making it vulnerable to attacks from outside and from within. The core ideas holding democracy are the cornerstone of the system itself. They exist to protect, justify, and defend the system. If not withheld and constantly reinforced, nothing will stay in the basics of the system, allowing it to survive and grow. The separation of the three heads of democracy is fundamental and should be emphasized. It protects the system from itself. The idea that government power should be limited by predetermined standards, upheld by a separate body, should be restrained by the natural process of concentration of power. It promises by itself the incapacity of a momentary electorate to take over the system. The limitation of the judging arm as a supervisor and watchdog by itself limits its power to a certain extent. making it a great balancing force. The third part of this trio is the executing part, which by itself is problematic. The correct line to draw in this case will concern only the inner population executing units. The governing part directly commands the military, making it irrelevant to our conversation. On the other hand, the police, which are in charge of executing laws and keeping orders, are in a democratic structure independent to a certain extent from the governing party. Its original purpose is to keep the citizens safe in their own cities, working for the sake of the safety of the citizens. This claim is more complicated to evaluate as the state of this separation in most Western countries is not clear-cut, making it by itself a complex subject. Nevertheless, some level of autonomy exists, as the police force is not operating as a private army of a politician, making it separate and autonomous to a certain extent. Following several generations of peace at home, it seems the Western societies and the democracy that support them are falling apart. A general dissatisfaction is felt all over the West, creating waves of violence and polarization of its people. This process has been observed in the last 20 years, accelerating in recent years. It seems we are living in a democratic crisis, putting all the project in question. This is seen all over the Western world and can be identified by the decline in trust in the governing institutions, the rising corruption seen all over the West, the polarization of its population, and the waves of violence erupting more often than before. The development of democracy is at a crossroads. The rise of communist ideologies can be seen as promoted within Western society. A growing part of the population seems dissatisfied with the current system, demanding the conversation and request for a better, valid, and relevant alternative. To better understand our options, I believe we need to start by understanding the problem at hand. It seems the issue has to do with the deterioration of everything that made democracy possible to begin with. It is a fact that on many levels, the outcome of the last 20 years has not been favorable for a big part of the population, regardless of the leaning of any specific government in this period. It seems democracy has failed many people, making them want to explore alternatives to avoid continuing with the current state. As I wrote in one of my previous books called Back to Ourselves, many extreme changes happened to us in the last 150 years, changing the rules of the game and creating a new reality. The change's speed and impact did not give enough time to assimilate and regroup before moving forward, leaving us vulnerable to small social issues that became, over time, the foundation for the reality we are currently living in. It seems we have walked a long way without re-evaluating the philosophical and practical ideas that hold democracy. I believe the irrelevance of the current political right and left, Republicans and Democrats, is a direct consequence of that process. They are both running after their own tail, concentrating on solutions for the symptoms and not the sickness of our society. The general dissatisfaction we are currently experiencing is the end of a process that evolved for a few decades. The division of society and its leaning toward extreme left or right are a clear symptom of this process. COVID definitely didn't help in any way. The West is currently at a crossroads in which a change is inevitable. The most relevant questions are what change it will be, who will lead it, and whether it will create a better future. Looking back on Western society, many similarities exist between our current state and the late 18th century. Back then, society was in the process of changing its fundamental governing structure hand in hand with the elimination of the power of the traditional Christianity and the church role for centuries. This societal change, led by the Enlightenment movement, has redefined society and its human condition. It allowed democracy to emerge after over 1700 years of absence in the West, establishing new philosophical ideas that lead the people to demand a new order. The striking similarities can be seen everywhere. The redefinition of words and concepts, the increased disparity between the ruling and the working class, the development of new dogmas, and the deep understanding of a coming change are all parallels. Democracy as we know it today has been created, formed, and spread based on the thinkers and axioms of that period. It shaped the new man as part of his nation, introduced the concept of subjectivism, and laid down the philosophical basis for the majority of the socialist movements that evolved since then. It was a period of revolt and change, one that arguably was much needed, redefining Europe as a whole and the rest of the world with it. In their book, The Fourth Turning, Neil Howe and William Strauss spoke of a cyclicality observed in human evolution. The general explanation is that every 4 generations, society reaches a point in which the system no longer satisfies the needs of the young generation, bringing to war and destruction, allowing the reconstruction of a society that fits better the needs of the people fighting their fight. Many people who consider themselves knowledgeable conclude that we are in a fourth turning moment, making the issue a problem that will pass if we let the time do its thing. Their underlying assumption is that while a change is needed, the new system rebuilt by the new generation will be a different variation of what we know with a twist after the hardship to come. Their assumption is based on a recency bias, one that assumes that if things were in a certain way until now, they would probably continue in kind of the same way. I will argue differently. I believe the democratic establishment is at risk. The majority of the people who address this crisis as a fourth turning miss the biggest picture. Democracy is young and fragile. The system has failed many people in the last 20 years, creating a new generation that does not take for granted that democracy is an absolute good. It is not evident to me that democracy will prevail this time around. Socialism is on the rise, hailed by many young adults. The incapacity of the boomer generation to justify democracy doesn't help either. If history can teach us anything, I would say that all the foundation for the general collapse of democracy has been laid out in the open. It is just a question of how much more deterioration is needed and where the alternative will come from. Organizations such as the World Economic Forum that aim for a one-world technocrat government, the rise of the Chinese, and the power grab of many Western governments are all powers that push society into such alternatives. The voices supporting democracy are fading away as they find little explanation to justify their failure in the last 20 years. History can be seen only from a specific point of view, one that follows a particular pattern. History, as a general concept, does not exist. It is everywhere and always a well-defined social process, concentrating on its advancement and consequences. If I'm right, looking at history as the development of philosophy will present us with a very concerning outlook. It can be said that the end of history has been reached with the death of Nietzsche. This is true if one believes that no more development is possible and that the current human state is the best we can reach. I am confident that this is not the case. If this is the best humans can create, maybe the cynicism movement is right, and we have no hope. Our current state is poor at best, if not catastrophic. When writing the lines above, I'm not referring in any case to the human standard of living or its current freedom. Undeniably, we are living in the best period ever lived by humans. The technological advancements of the last 150 years, the development of free democracies, and the introduction of medicine have created a standard of living never dreamed of 200 years ago. My pessimism expressed above is unrelated to all of that, as it addresses the state of our society and the philosophy that supports it. The great philosophers of the past have created a path that allowed us to march toward democracy. I do not doubt in my mind that democracy is the best way to govern ourselves. My point is that we are far from finishing our work. We are much closer than ever, but still far enough to call it a day. I believe that if Nietzsche was the last philosopher, the end is clear, one that will bring us back to a non-democratic governance. We will return to our old habits, erasing all the fundamental work that man has done before and for us. There is no doubt in my mind, as I wrote in my 2018 book, Back to Ourselves, that the current structure of democracy is doomed to fail. It is a natural path for any new experiment or unknown path. It requires a long process of trial and error, one that creates some misery and harshness in its process. Nevertheless, precisely, these failures will allow us to build a better structure of democracy, one that will bring prosperity, freedom, equality of opportunities, and peace to humans as a whole. After long reflection on the subject, I came to believe the only way to save the democratic establishment is to reorganize and refine it, to make it relevant to our current existence based on this organism's development and natural evolution over time. I believe that there is a solution for this crisis that will make democracy more relevant and potentially the best governing system for humans as a whole. The fact that democracy is failing should have been predicted by many thinkers, as it has been established in a different period and is by itself an experiment, which doesn't mean it is the wrong mechanism. It implies that a change is needed, one that takes the new developments of the last 60 years into consideration and brings back the system to be relevant for the people living in it. As I mentioned previously, the democratic structure we knew no longer existed. Some still claim it exists mainly due to their mental need of delusion, and others due to their incapacity to accept it is lost. A change is upon us whether we like it or not. If we are to continue to live in a democratic society, we need to reshape it is unavoidable. If we, as a Western society, will not manage to do so, it is just a question of time until we lose it. It is not too late to make this change. It is going to be painful and challenging. But in my mind, any alternative is just much worse. For more interesting conversations about complicated topics, check my channel or click the link for my website below. If you like what you hear, please consider subscribing and liking this video.